If you're old enough to remember grunge, I have a funny story for you. So let's get right into it. So it was 1992, and there was this independent record label called Sub Pop. Sub Pop was based out of Seattle and had signed grunge bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Mudhoney. That year, the New York Times contacted Sub Pop to get information so they could write a story about grunge. Jonathan Poman, Sub Pop's co founder, didn't feel like doing the interview, so he referred the reporter to Sub Pop's former secretary, Megan Jasper. Now, Jasper had been laid off from Sub Pop due to the label's finances, but she remained on good terms with Poman. And Poman, knowing Megan's sort of grunge mentality of sarcasm and humor, asked her to do the interview. So then Rick Marin, the New York Times reporter, called Jasper for her input. He told her that besides writing the main article, he also wanted to put together a lexicon of grunge slang. What he didn't know was that there was no such thing as grunge slang. This is when Megan decided to pull a similar prank that she had done before. Earlier in the year, a reporter from a British magazine called Sky had asked her the same question about the grunge slang, and on the fly, Megan had made up phrases which ended up getting printed. This time, when Marin asked her about the slang terms, Megan once again made up a list of phrases, pretending that these words were used in the local grunge community. So let's get into that list that she gave Rick Marin, and then I'll tell you afterwards what happened. Okay, so first on the list is bloated or big bag of bloatation, which she said meant you were drunk, which is funny because alcohol can bloat you. So that's actually kind of accurate. Bound and hagged, which meant staying home on Friday or Saturday night. And when I read this, I was like, well, what about the other nights? If you're staying home on a Thursday night, was there a phrase for that? And also, people used to say, like, oh, the old hag, like your girlfriend or your wife. So that's kind of funny related to that. Next on the list is cobnobbler, which means loser. Dish, she said, meant desirable guy. And it's funny because in British slang, it does mean that a person is attractive if you call someone a dish. Fuzz, heavy wool sweaters, which were popular in grunge. Plats, which meant platform shoes. Harsh realm meant bummer. More on this phrase later. Kickers, which meant heavy boots, which I assume meant the combat boots that were popular in grunge. Lame stain, which is like, how did she come up with this phrase? But uncool person. So the word is uncool. It sounds dorky and means uncool person. So that makes sense. The next phrase is rock on, which means a happy goodbye. And when I thought of this, I thought of an 80s song. It was like late 80s. This song came out by Michael Damian called Rock On. But anyway, score, which means great. I feel like people used that in the 90s too. So maybe she started something there. Swinging on the flippity flop, which meant hanging out. That is a mouthful, so awkward. Swinging on the flippity flop to hang out. Tom Tom Club, which means uncool outsiders. And there was a band by that name. They were already in existence, so I don't know if she got it from that band, but another hysterical, wacky phrase. It's like, where did she get that from? Whack slacks, which means old ripped jeans. So if you look at old pics of Nirvana, they were wearing their whack slacks. And then tuna platter, which means a hot date. It's like, I don't know. I was going to say I can't make this stuff up, but she did make this stuff up. So what's so funny is how ridiculous these terms are, but yet the New York Times ate it up, taking her at her word. And I know this because all of the phrases but one ended up getting printed as a sidebar to the New York Times article, Grunge, a Success Story. Just this title alone is so cringe because grunge was about like rebellion and being independent and not being corporate. So this success story title was probably the worst one that could have been chosen. The article was published as a full-page story in November of 1992 in the Sunday Styles section. The title of the sidebar was Lexicon of Grunge, Breaking the Code. I would like to add that this story is probably what helped grunge to become mainstream, and grunge going mainstream is probably one of the reasons why it faded out by the mid-90s. And by the way, it was the tuna platter phrase that the New York Times left off for obvious reasons. It just sounds gross. So why did she do it? Well, Megan was 25 years old at the time, so she fit in that age demographics who made up the grunge scene in Seattle. Also, according to some of the articles I read, this community in Seattle was annoyed at the mainstream media's interest in them, mainly because the mainstream media meant corporations and greed. Another possible reason was that the media was making assumptions about the local culture that weren't always accurate, like the misconception that there must be some sort of grunge jargon. So it seems that there was a lot of frustration there in the local community. I also think the fact that they were outsiders played a role too. People used to be more protective of their communities, and I think if this had been the Seattle Times asking, her response would have been different. But then again, if it had been the Seattle Times, they probably would have known better. Now let's get into some things that Megan probably didn't expect. The first thing that happened is that the band Mudhoney had seen the British article and deliberately started dropping phrases like hobnobbler into their interviews. So apparently they got the joke. Another surprising thing that happened is that the Ottawa Citizen ended up reprinting the list that she gave the New York Times a month after its original publication, which I find hysterical. It means her phrases were printed in yet another location. Of course, not having the internet back then like it is today was helpful because otherwise they could have just done their own research online. Now, there was one media outlet that was skeptical of all of this. Journalist Thomas Frank of The Baffler didn't believe the phrases to be true and contacted Megan. She copped to the hoax, and then Frank contacted the New York Times. The New York Times then contacted Megan again, who denied it. She later said that she denied it because she was worried that Marin and the editor of the Sunday Styles section, Penelope Green, would get fired. Eventually, the New York Times realized that Thomas Frank was right, that they had been punked, basically. So Green typed up a correction, but for some reason, maybe because they were embarrassed by the whole thing, it was never printed. What's interesting about this hoax is that even though the phrases were fake, the list has actually had some cultural relevance. According to Megan, when she attended some shows in Seattle, some people had clipped out the sidebar from the article and pinned the phrases to their shirts. Also, some t-shirts were made with some of the phrases and then sold. Then there was a comic book series and television series, both named Harsh Realm. Remember that phrase? In addition to all of that, there was another comic called The Dirty Pair, and the character Slang included Harsh Realm. So that ended up becoming a really popular phrase. Also, the bass guitarist of a band called X-Cops had a stage persona named Ex-Patrolman Cobb Noveler. And look, I'm making a video about all of this over 30 years later. So in researching this story, I came across another interesting fact that I think I need to share. As I mentioned before, Megan Jasper had been Sub Pop's former receptionist when this prank started. Before that, she had been an intern originally hired in 1989. While eventually Sub Pop emerged from their financial difficulties, thanks in large part to the success of Nirvana's Nevermind album, and the business survived. Not only that, the biggest twist in the story is that in 2016, Megan became Sub Pop's CEO. And this is no small feat because Sub Pop has had partnerships with large labels like Geffen and Warner Brothers. So what an interesting and kind of happy ending for Megan. The young woman who fooled 3 different media outlets ends up becoming the CEO of the company that was at the heart of grunge music in Seattle. I want to say one final thing before I wrap this up. I think what Megan did was hysterical. I'm like, good for her, because it was that whole thing with grunge where it was rebellion against corporations, and the New York Times was a corporation, still is, but it was, I think, probably even bigger back then. And so for her to pull this prank twice and then have the second list that she gave to the New York Times reprinted is hysterical. And to have some impact on culture with phrases like harsh realm, that's pretty impressive for someone who was 25. Like, I would never have the gumption to do that, not in a million years. So I say good for her. Well, to end this video in honor of that list, I came up with some sentences using Megan's phrases, and it goes like this. Don't be a cobnobbler or lamestain. We've been swinging on the flippity flop and it's been score. If you're ever bound and hagged, you can put on your fuzz and wax slacks and come back for another one of my videos. Rock on. Let me know in the comments if grunge had an impact on your life at all. I remember listening to Nirvana a lot and I still love their music. And I remember dressing sort of like that at the time, not maybe quite as grungy as some of the bands did, but I had some ripped jeans, a little bit of flannel, and this was my attempt to dress grunge in 2026. So it's about all I have in my wardrobe that looks semi-grunge. But anyway, in honor of that, thought I would make an effort. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you'll come back, and in the meantime, take care.